And we are live. Thank you all for being here today or tonight for some of you. Today is going to be an exciting show. I'm with my good friend Ian Shepherd from the Production Advice website, from the Mastering Show podcast, which is an amazing podcast. I'm going to leave all the links down in this description down below. And also, of course, Ian is an amazing mastering engineer, and this is what he's known for. So I'm gonna put add Ian to the stream right away, and we are gonna start that exciting live stream with my good friend Ian. How's it going, man?
Hi, Chris. I'm good. Thanks. How are you?
Pretty good, thank you. So, guys, we will jump into the topic right away, and just bear with us because after we're going to answer your questions. So prepare your questions. You can even start writing them down. I'm going to go over the questions afterward. All right. So, Ian, we're going to talk about loudness. There's a lot of questions about how loud should we master our music for streaming services like YouTube Music, Spotify, Tidal, iTunes, Apple Music, and so on. So this can be very confusing for a lot of people. And, we get to deal with a bunch of different metering systems like, RMS meter, LUFS, which people talk a lot about. And, we we always have that in mind just to aim for a specific target. So we have the assurance that our music is going to be loud enough to be played on streaming services. And I receive a lot of questions about um, people having a hard time to get the perfect loudness for streaming services. They're going to send me questions about, I aimed for minus 14 LUFS and it ended up, sounding a bit quieter than other mixes on Spotify and stuff like that. So first, just so everybody understands what LUFS metering means, maybe we should start by having a quick explanation of what LUFS meter means.
Sure. So LUFS stands for Loudness Units Full Scale. So loudness units is what it sounds like. It's a way of measuring loudness, which had not existed before in a standardized way until it was introduced a few years ago. And the full scale bit just means, like we have dBFS for the peak level, you have 0 at the top of the meters, and then the loudness units are measured down from that. So if you have minus 14 LUFS, for example, it means that the loudness is 14 dB below the maximum peak level that you could have.
Yeah.
And I think the thing that I would say is actually LUFS is not that different to RMS, which lots of people are more comfortable with because it's been around for longer.
Exactly. Yeah.
Especially when you've got a balanced EQ spectrum. The problem with RMS is that it's more sensitive to bass than our ears are, because the idea of the meter is to try and get a kind of visual or numerical idea of something that kind of connects to what we hear, and so when it works, that's fine, but if it doesn't, then you get weird results because you choose a number and it doesn't sound the way that you expect. And that can happen with RMS. So a really good example of that recently was the Billie Eilish song Zanny, which has that massive distorted bass kind of comes in the chorus. And some people kind of were posting screenshots of this and saying this thing hits 0 RMS. And that kind of blew their minds a bit. The interesting thing, that bass sounds huge and massive, but I don't think it sounds as loud as I imagine when I think of a 0 RMS. And that's because the RMS meter is so sensitive to the bass. So the meter reads really high, but we probably don't hear it as extreme as that. So if you look at that same song with an LUFS meter, the LUFS measurement basically tries to get closer to what we hear with our ears. So there's an EQ curve in there to match the sensitivity of our ears, because our ears have different sensitivities at different frequencies. And if you put an LUFS meter on Zanny, it still looks quite scary, but it doesn't look anywhere near as scary as the RMS version. And so for me, LUFS is just a better version of RMS.
Okay.
And I think then maybe the other thing, just to kind of following up on some of the things you were saying there, is to no, I'll pause there.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so if we look at the, remember when I first started to learn about RMS metering, Bob Katz came up with the K system, which was based, if I'm correct, on RMS metering.
Yeah.
So minus 14, like K14, it was called. It was like kind of the sweet spot where the dynamics of a master was at its best, if I'm correct, if I remember correctly.
Well, yeah, that's the idea of it. I think actually the K system had 2 or 3 different levels. So I think it also had K10 maybe and K18.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was basically the idea
like
that you to figure out how loud you wanted to make something, you chose the metering system that you were happy with. So by choosing K18 or K14 or K10 or whatever it was, you were basically kind of choosing a ballpark to be in. And when you change the meter over, the point where the meters started to go red would move. So if you had K18, the meters would start to go red at quite a low RMS level. K14, it was a bit higher, and K10, you get pretty loud before the meters would go red. Because, it's based on we're all used to having the meters just push a little bit into the red. That's kind of way back with the needle meters, VU meters that I still like to use. You have them go up to 0 and push a little bit above. And of course, it's what you can't do with a peak meter. You don't want to let a peak meter go into the red because then it's going to clip.
Exactly.
Which was a kind of an adjustment we all had to make back when peak meters were first introduced, when like early digital stuff came into use. So yeah, basically, take the K14, you're basically saying, okay, 0 is K14. And then Bob's advice was, you can let it push a couple of dBs above that. So up to kind of minus 12 RMS. Exactly. And that's going to be a great place to be. So that's very similar to the idea of kind of having in mind this idea of minus 14 LUFS when you master for online. And that was one of the things that I was going to pick up on that you said earlier. I think that's one of the most common misunderstandings about all of this. You were saying, the most common question I get is, how loud should it be? People want a number to go for, right? They're just like, I understand all of this. It's complicated, blah, blah, blah. Just tell me what to aim for and I'll go for it.
Yeah.
The problem
we know when we're in the digital world, we don't go above 0 dBFS, because we have that number. That's our limit. So we're used to have some kind of guidelines, how much loud I should record my signal, for gain staging and stuff like that. So we get, of course, the same kind of approach when it comes to mastering and loudness. We have that, that we're thinking that we need that specific number to reach for.
Yeah, and it's understandable. It's especially when we know that the streaming services have these reference levels, right? So if you master something louder than minus 14 for most of them, we know now that they're going to turn it down. So that also encourages you to think, well, that's what I should aim for. And the thing that surprises people often when they talk to me, because I set up the loudness penalty website that tells you what is going to happen to your songs if you want to put them online. You can drag a song onto it and it doesn't get uploaded, but the browser figures out what's going to be done to it, and it'll tell you how much it'll be turned up or down. So people make all of these connections and go, oh, okay, so that's going to tell us what to aim for, right? And the thing that surprises people is that I would say, no, you don't want to aim for I don't recommend you aim for any specific target. And the reason for that is, if you need to think about a couple of examples. So if you imagine, let's say, just a full-on rock track, right, that just kind of comes in, pushes all the way through, the Ace of Spades by Motorhead, say, a classic example, something like that. That just kind of, it starts, it goes all the way through and it stops. That has a similar loudness all the way through. So let's say you set that to aim for minus 14. If that was just as an example, right? I'm not saying you should do that, but if you did, that's one song. But then you think about, if you're going for classic examples, something like Stairway to Heaven by Led Zeppelin, where it starts off quiet and it gets louder and louder and louder and louder and louder right up to the end.
Yeah.
Or if you think about any kind of, I mean, even a lot of metal tunes have more variety in them, right? They're not just flat out all the way through. They might have a quiet introduction, or they might have a quiet middle eight, you know, and then you get to stuff like progressive or jazz where the loudness varies all the time. The point of this is, if you think about, let's say, think about Stairway to Heaven, if you're measuring the loudness of that, it's going to start off pretty low and it's going to gradually build up all the way through till it gets to the end. But the overall value that an LUFS meter will give you, this is slightly complicated because there's 3 different types of LUFS reading. There's the integrated, which I think of as the long-term value, which is for a whole song or a whole album or a whole movie or whatever. So it's a big chunk of audio and it's one value for the whole thing. Then there's the short term, which kind of varies more as the music does. So that's what you'd see growing up as Stairway to Heaven kind of plays.
Exactly, yeah.
And then there's the momentary, which is very fast and is kind of, it's not the same as the peak, but it's much more, you know, you could track our voices kind of going up and down in loudness as we talk in this conversation. So if you think about Stairway to Heaven, the overall loudness, to begin with, it's going to be low. And then as it builds up and builds up and builds up, it can get bigger, but it won't be as high as if it had been, imagine if it was that full loudness at the end all the way through, right? That's going to give you an even higher number because it's basically kind of an average over the whole length of the song. So if you have something that has variety, it's not going to be the maximum, it's going to be lower. So if you were mastering Stairway to Heaven and you measured it and you set its final loudness to be -14 LUFS, chances are, if you played that next to the Ace of Spades, also mastered at -14 LUFS, the end of Stairway to Heaven would end up sounding way louder than Ace of Spades, right? And that's where the problem comes in, that if you take this overall value, it doesn't know anything about the musical content. It's just a number, right? It's a useful kind of sort of rule of thumb, shorthand. On the whole, if something is up at -6, -8 LUFS, it's pretty freaking loud. And if it's down at -14 or -16, it's more conservative, but it doesn't tell you anything about what's inside it. And that's why I say using a target loudness is not going to work. It doesn't work musically, right? We don't want the end of Stairway to Heaven to be way louder than the Ace of Spades, because the Ace of Spades is going to be one of the loudest things you ever hear. And I mean, the same thing would apply if you then just sort of took an acoustic guitar ballad. If you mastered that also to -14, that would sound way too loud, way louder than it should compared to both of them. So that's the reason I don't recommend people master to a certain target loudness, because it's just going to be nonsense in terms of the musicality of it. But then when you think about the online streaming services and this idea that they're going to turn it all down anyway, you think, well, should we not use it for that? And that's where I kind of say that it's useful to know the numbers and to understand what's going to happen, which is why we made the loudness penalty website. But you shouldn't be deciding it based on the numbers. So, you know, for example, if you master a song and you put it onto the loudness penalty website and you find out that YouTube is going to turn it down by 6 or 7 dBs, on the one hand, that's fine, because that's what they do. And you just click the preview button, listen to it, then go to another tab in your browser and compare it to some other songs that are kind of similar to yours. And if yours sounds good in comparison to them, well, then you're fine.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of dynamics. So when I see a number or a reduction that big, I kind of think, I at least want to do the experiment and see how would that sounded if I hadn't pushed it quite as hard, if I'd just given it a bit less limiting, a bit less clipping and saturation. Maybe I can get it to sound as good, but with a smaller penalty. Let's see what that sounds like. But that's a kind of an aesthetic choice, right? That's exactly. You decide based on your opinion. No one says you have to aim for either value. So for me, the loudest stuff that I master tends to get turned down by 2, maybe 3 dBs on YouTube. And I'm comfortable with that. It's like, okay, because if I try and push it any louder, it'll just get turned down more. But here's the key that relates to your question. If I mastered it, I mean, the good thing is that the values they've chosen allow me to master exactly the way that I want to, right? So it's not like I look at this stuff when I'm working and go, oh, I need to hit these numbers. You know, I just master the song so that it sounds good to me, and then out of interest at the end of it, I will check the numbers just to make sure that everything's working the way that I am. And when I do that, I find, okay, my loudest stuff is being turned down by 2 or 3 dBs.
Exactly.
But if I went in and said, oh no, it should be at -14 or whatever, and kind of went against my instincts for the music and then listened to it, I might not end up with the final sound that I wanted, because to a certain extent, the whole process of making it loud, you know, there's lots of other stuff that there's a big difference between measuring loud on the meters and sounding loud in real life. And so, I mean, a classic example would be if you record an explosion, but turn it way down and then play it back. Yeah, it measures low, but we know that it's a loud sound, right? It still sounds like a loud sound. It's just a loud sound that's been turned down.
Exactly.
Whereas if you record somebody whispering or singing softly and crank it right up, we hear that it measures louder, but we still know that it's a soft, gentle sound. So there's all this other stuff that goes into things that making things sound loud. And one of the things that happens with a really aggressive mix is you can get kind of density. So there's less contrast between the loud and the quiet stuff. You probably do have some more limiting, some more saturation happening in there. All of that contributes to the aggression of the sound and the way that it feels. And that's all good, right? You don't want to undo that just because the numbers tell you something. But what's useful about it is seeing the opportunity, because what I see a lot of is people who say, oh, well, I have to make my music this loud because otherwise it won't sell, or the label will turn it down, or people won't like the way that it sounds. And in my experience, that's not true either, right? The stuff needs to be loud enough so that it sounds right, and so that it so that it sounds right, basically. You know, you need to go through that process of getting the sound that you want. And having stuff that's too quiet and too dynamic can be also a problem, can be almost as much of a problem as being too loud. But for me, there's a sweet spot. You get to a certain point and pushing it louder doesn't get you any closer to that sound. It just starts to involve compromises to the sound, like, you know, it starts to sound flat and lifeless and held in and dull.
Exactly.
And it gets turned down more. So for me, there's no point in going beyond that point. I would rather just stay in that sweet spot where it's loud enough, but not too loud. And the good news for anybody who's like listening to this is that I can offer you a suggestion, not for the overall loudness, but if you're measuring that short-term loudness on an LUFS meter, or even if you're using an RMS meter, my suggestion would be to have the loudest moments at about -10 LUFS or -10 RMS. And then you balance everything else musically to that. So that's what I would do if I was mastering Ace of Spades and Stairway to Heaven to go on a compilation album, say, I would have Ace of Spades -12 all the way through. And then I would have the end of Stairway to Heaven, the very loudest bit, -10, sorry, not -12, -10. And the end of it maybe pushing -10, maybe a little bit louder if it felt like it needed it. But then before that, everything would build up to that moment. And that's kind of something that I've sort of settled on as a recommendation for people in the last few years. But that's not because of the streaming services. That's just something that I've been doing my entire career. That's just the way that I work. It's been successful for me. I've been mastering for over 25 years now.
That's a long time, Ian.
I know, yeah. Well, look, you can see all these greys that my COVID haircut is bringing out so beautifully. And by the way, I apologize for my stubble. I did intend to shave for this, but
yeah, same here. That is actually a very, very good tip. So basically, you just don't look or work with the LUFS meter as a specific target number to reach for. It's more like kind of an average, and you play around with that, you know. So I think that's what people have a hard time to understand, you know.
Yeah, well, if you use this approach with the no louder than -10,
yeah,
I mean, you could choose your own numbers, right? Because some people will be going, well, I don't want to be like as loud as this stuff. I want to sound like they did back in the late 80s, early 90s. So in that case, you might choose, okay, I'm not going to go any louder than -12 or -14, whatever it is. For me, -10 is the point where you start losing any benefits. Almost anything above that is a problem. but if you did what I just said and mastered those two songs with Ace of Spades, same loudness all the way through, that's going to come out with an overall value of about -10, -11. But you master Stairway to Heaven so that the end of it is that loud. The overall value is probably going to be -14 or even -16 or something. That's fine, right? I look at those and I go, huh, that's interesting, because most of the streaming services don't turn quiet stuff up.
Yeah, I was actually about to ask. That was a question I had.
Yeah, so Spotify does, and we'll talk about that in a second, but YouTube, Tidal, Amazon Music, Deezer, most of them don't turn the quiet stuff up. So if you think their reference level is -14, so they would take my -12 master and turn it down by a couple of dBs.
Do they all use LUFS metering for loudness?
No. That's another reason that we made the loudness penalty website. The most important one that doesn't is Spotify. So they use this thing called replay gain, which is RMS based. But actually the real killer for replay gain is that they pay attention to the loudest moment in the song.
Yeah.
Which actually, when you think about it, kind of relates to what I've just been saying. So, and it's quite a small section. It's only like 5% of your song needs to be super loud.
Wow.
And they will say, okay, this is super loud, I'm going to turn it down. So if you make a master where there's one bit that's really, really loud, they will turn the whole song down.
Yeah.
Based on that number, and then the rest of it might end up sounding weak in comparison to the other stuff that you're listening to. So you have to pay a lot of attention to the internal dynamics, as I call them, the contrast between the verse and the chorus, the loud and the quiet sections. I mean, the good news is, in my experience, you can pretty much always find a compromise that works. And actually that compromise ends up being pretty close to what I would suggest anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's something to bear in mind. And
but still, it's still a big difference.
Well, it's a big difference. And I mean, the thing that you notice is that if you measure some stuff on the loudness penalty website, for example, most things you'll find that YouTube and Spotify, which is basically LUFS and replay gain, come out similar, and that's fine. But on some material, and actually Zanny is an example, the one or other of them could be as much as 2 or 3 dBs different. So Zanny, for example, gets turned down much more. Hang on, let me get this the right way around. I think it gets turned down more based on an LUFS measurement than on a replay gain measurement. And then there are other songs that are the other way around. So when that happens, this is the problem people have, right? They hear, oh, -14 LUFS or whatever it is. They aim for that target. They might not be achieving the sound they want in getting there. That's one factor. But the other one is, if Spotify replay gain thinks that song has a different loudness, then they're going to get a surprise when they upload it to Spotify. They kind of go, well, I uploaded it at -14 and it sounds really, and it's being turned down way more. I mean, and literally you can have stuff, I've heard stuff that was mastered at -14, but Spotify still wants to turn it down by 2 dBs.
Wow.
Even though the overall reference level for Spotify is about -14, right? But you can, so if you play loads of songs and put it on the meter, it'll come up as -14, but individual songs could be louder or quieter than that. Whereas on YouTube, it's basically -14, you get what you expect.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's and this is where people start to get annoyed, and they're like, wow, this loudness normalization sucks, because I think it's a good idea, right? I mean, the streaming services are doing it to stop us being blasted by super loud songs, because it's really annoying. You're listening to something and then something else comes in really loud. That's why they're doing it, not for anything to do with the loudness wars or anything else. For me as a mastering engineer, it's an opportunity, because it means that I can allow something to be more dynamic if I want it to.
Yeah, exactly.
Know that it's still the super loud stuff is not going to blow my work out of the water. So that's great, because it gives me more creative freedom, and my clients more creative freedom, providing they kind of go sort of understand it and want to do that. So that's a good thing. But we're in the early stages. It's only been around for 3 or 4 years.
Yeah,
everything's changing really fast. It's like YouTube switched from using their old system to using LUFS like a year or two ago.
Yeah, and I think Spotify is supposed to do so.
They are going to do it at some point, but we don't know when. And actually, I'm on a couple of AES working groups.
Yeah, okay.
That are coming up with recommendations for streaming services, and I think it's likely that Spotify will probably wait until those recommendations are ready, and then kind of maybe go along with those. Well, hopefully.
Yeah. Cool.
There was one other thing I was going to say just before you asked me another question. Yeah, so people get annoyed by it because they get unexpected results, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But that's another reason why we made the loudness penalty website, because you can check it out without uploading the music. So you can do whatever you think is creatively right, and then you can go to the site, look at the numbers, preview. You press the preview, and it'll play it back at the appropriate level for whatever streaming service you're on. And that you can then make an informed choice, right? You're not going to get a nasty surprise when you upload it to Spotify. You can.
Yeah, that's a very cool tool. Let me try to get on the site and screen share that with you guys. Let me check here. But just before we go forward, just want to thank you all for being here on the stream. It's quite amazing. We're more than 100 people right now watching this stream live, which is amazing. So thank you again. Please like this video if you're on YouTube or Facebook. Share if you want other people to come and join us. We're going to start answering questions from you guys in a few minutes. Let me just
I can hear my kids in my head saying, smash that like button.
Exactly. I just read something earlier about your microphone, Ian, that was a bit too loud. I don't know if that's the case. It's still the case. Let me know if both of our volumes are balanced or not. I actually increased my gain on my side. So if there's a problem, guys, let me know in the comment section.
I'm probably shouting, which is ironic for somebody who's always talking about loudness.
Exactly. Okay, let me try to share this screen here. All right, so you guys see this Loudness Penalty Analyzer website? Do you see it, Ian, on your side?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Let me just upload any master that I have here. There's probably something right here, master. There you go. Let's go with this one. So this is how it's going to look like when using this website, which is very cool. It's a very good tool.
It's very cool. It's very free. And it's worth saying again, it doesn't upload the audio. All of the processing is done in the browser, so it's completely secure. It's secure as your computer is in the first place.
Yeah, exactly. So that is the master that I just uploaded, and it's going to tell me how much those streaming services are going to turn the song down. Okay, so now they're going to turn it down by quite a lot, in my opinion. So this is basically what we get. So we can listen to the mix, the master from that point on, and this is going to give you a very good idea on what to expect when your song is going to be played on those services.
Yeah,
I kind of like that.
The other thing that's worth saying is that it's something that people get confused by is often when they upload their stuff and then they hear it playing back, they think that it sounds more crushed. That doesn't happen. So that song was like minus 4.6 dBs, which is kind of on the hot side of what I would recommend, but probably sounds great. They only use a level change when they're turning stuff down. So if you put your stuff into loudness penalty and preview it, and it kind of sounds more squashed than you expect when you compare it to other stuff, that's going to be a result of the processing that you did on the way in, not something that the streaming services have done. None of the streaming services use any dynamic compression or limiting, except for Spotify. Spotify has a limiter when they turn things up. So if you put something in that's quiet, and
I see.
in which case you would see a plus value on the site there, right? It would say Spotify like +2 or +3. At that point, that's because Spotify thinks that it's not loud enough and they want to turn it up, and they will use a limiter to prevent clipping. And that limiter doesn't sound great. So people making more dynamic masters, maybe jazz or folk or classical, especially classical, they do hear that and get upset by it. And I understand that. And one of the things we're going to be recommending, or we already recommend, but going forwards, is that Spotify should stop turning things up. Because the other interesting thing is that obviously if you make all of the songs the same level, then that musical problem that I mentioned comes into play, right? Where things that were supposed to be quiet sound loud, and things that were supposed to be loud sound quiet. Whereas the way that Tidal does it, which I think is the best way, is that they base it all on the album loudness. So Tidal will measure the whole album. They'll take the loudest song, and let's say the loudest song was going to be turned down by 4.6. They'll turn the whole album down, even when you're in shuffle mode or playlist mode. So it keeps the musical differences between the songs, which when they tested it, I think 80% of people preferred. And you don't get that same thing of the quiet stuff coming up and the loud stuff going down, because everything stays in proportion.
Yeah, okay, makes sense.
And interestingly, that fits in perfectly with the way that I'm suggesting people master, right? Which is you make all the loudest bits similar in loudness, and then everything else kind of relative to that. So that's going to work perfectly. So it's another example of the situation at the moment is complicated. I mean, all of those numbers are a bit different because all of the different streaming services use slightly different reference levels, and some of them use replay gain, and some of them use LUFS, and some of them use
exactly.
iTunes. Our value for iTunes is still only an estimate because nobody knows exactly what Apple do. And actually, iTunes is a bit bizarre. If anything, I would say so iTunes is also the only one where it's not on by default. All the others, I mean, like on YouTube, you can't disable this. It just happens. Tidal and Spotify, you can turn it off in the preferences, but when you first install, it's switched on automatically.
Okay.
iTunes doesn't have it switched on automatically to begin with, but lots of users do use it. It's called Sound Check, and it's in the preferences there. But the weird thing about Sound Check is I will often find the louder stuff ends up sounding quieter than the quieter stuff did beforehand. So in my opinion, that one, they need, well, I hope that everybody switches over to LUFS, right? Because that would just make it so much simpler. And if they would also go along with the lower reference level that the AES is recommending, that gives us even more creative freedom.
Yeah.
It's so close, right? I can see this thing in the future happening where actually everybody is happy about loudness normalization and knows exactly what's going on, and we can all start worrying about the music again instead of the loudness stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
But how long it'll take us to get there, I don't know.
Let's start answering some questions from you guys. Let's start with this one. That one came on earlier in the stream, even before we started. So we probably partially answered that question. So when I A/B my master to other mixes, none are the same in any metering, the DBFS, LUFS, etc. Just what I should really shoot for. Yeah, we actually talked about that in the first part of the stream. Tips on how to keep the LUFS consistent, dynamic range tips too.
Yeah, so my answer to that is what I was saying about the loudest bit at -10, no louder, or kind of lower if that's your preference. I mean, I should probably say that's pretty conservative by modern standards. A lot of so if you make the loudest sections at -10 and you've got a lot of dynamic variety, you're probably going to get values about -12, -14 for a good number of songs. There's a lot of pop stuff out there there's a lot of stuff that's up at -8 overall, right? So probably gets up to -6 or -4 at the loudest sections. This is if you're measuring the CDs. And there's some stuff that's like even louder, like -4 overall. There's a Miley Cyrus track that's at -4, which makes no sense to me. It's a kind of folk thing. And it's like, why was that supposed to be? Anyway.
Do you remember the song?
I can't remember the name of it. No, it was off an album a year or two ago. I can probably find it and post it in the comments for people later. I mean, it sounds distorted, and you can hear it pumping and all. It's just weird, but and that's why Vinny is finding what he finds, right? Which is that so you measure that and you get -4, and you think, well, okay, maybe that's what I should aim for. And then you measure something from the 80s and it's at -16. That's 12 dBs difference. That's 4 times the power in terms of the signal. But the key thing is that hardly anybody hears it that way, right? Because this is my new favorite statistic. In 2017, 87% of US music industry revenue came from non-physical sources.
Wow.
Right? So that means only 13% of the money in the US in 2017, and it's going to have moved on. We're 3 years away from that now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Came from CDs and vinyl and cassettes and whatever else
crazy.
People buy. So everybody else is listening to either streaming or downloads.
Yeah. Wow.
If they're listening to streaming, the chances are they're hearing it with normalization. So Miley has been turned down by 10 dBs, and is no louder when they hear it than anything else. It's going to be more dense. It's going to be more distorted and all the rest of it. So it's going to affect the sound, but the actual loudness is not going to be any higher. And even people who've got downloads, this is the other thing. Some people who use downloads will enable sound check or the equivalent in their player. Everybody else just adjusts the volume control. If you
very simple.
Yeah, excuse me. It's the first thing everybody does. You put on a piece of music, and if it's not loud enough, you turn it up, and if it's too loud, you turn it down. And at that point, the original level. So this is what's so
it's kind of irrelevant at this point
for me as a mastering engineer. It's irrelevant. It's like you want it to be in that sweet spot. You want it to sound right.
Yeah.
But other than that, it doesn't really matter.
No.
So anyway, yeah.
No, you're right. Totally right. So let's continue. But first, I just want to point out that the loudness penalty analyzer is also a plugin. There's a plugin version.
Yep.
Okay, that I use on my side. I love to use it when I do some mastering, and I love to use that at the end of the mastering. Once I'm done, I just want to check how that's going to translate on streaming services. It's the perfect tool to do so directly in your DAW. And I want to just do a quick pitch because I know that this week the plugin is on sale. And even without the sale, it's not an expensive plugin. But it's on sale for $34 until the end of the week, which is a very good deal. So I left already the link down in the description of the video. Okay, so before you leave, check it out. The link is there, and pay yourself a treat and go and get that very cool plugin. I've been using it for more than a year and quite love it, to be honest. It's very well done. It's a nice tool.
That's great. No, thank you for that. The plugin is nice. If people can play around with the site for free and see if they find it useful. If you find you're using it a lot, it's nice to not have to save the file out and drag it in and look at it and go back and tweak and save it out again and all that stuff. There's also another couple of cool things about the plugin that the website doesn't do. One of them is obviously that it's in real time. So to get the overall value for the song, to know what's going to happen eventually, you need to play it from beginning to end. Just imagine Stairway to Heaven. It'll start off saying, oh, no loudness penalty at all, and it gets to the end, it's like, oh,
exactly.
Actually there is a penalty. But the cool thing about that is you can see it in real time. So if the song is getting turned down, and particularly on Spotify, right, where such short sections cause a problem, you can watch it and go, okay, that's the bit that triggered the big reduction that I'm hearing.
Yeah.
And then you can think, well, maybe I'll just ease that section back a little bit, perhaps, or maybe everything else needs to come up a bit, or whatever it is. You can experiment and kind of work with that. So that's cool. The other thing that's good is that if you have a song that is not going to be turned down, let's say you master something at -16 overall, if you measure that, it's not going to be adjusted on YouTube. And that's actually because it could have been 2 dBs louder without them deciding they wanted to turn it down. On the website, you don't get that information. You get the 2 lines that mean nothing's going to happen to this. That doesn't mean it's perfect. It just means it's not going to be turned down. The cool thing about the plugin is you can hover over the value and it'll tell you, oh, you could have turned this up by 2 dBs without causing a penalty. Of course, you're going to get a couple of dBs more limiting if you do that. So it's always a trade-off. But there's some extra kind of helpful stuff in there.
That's cool. I like that, just I would say work with an LUFS meter during your mastering, and don't go crazy with that, and at the end, use the loudness penalty analyzer, and you'll have a very good idea.
Yep.
If you're in the ball game or not,
Yep.
So let's continue. We're gonna answer mastering related questions. Since I have Ian on, so all other, Cubase questions and, recording mixing, we're going to have to wait for another time. So let's continue with, let me see here. What about this one? Any tips for mastering hybrid? So basically with plugins and hardware.
So I talk a lot about mastering on my site and on the podcast, obviously. And one of my unofficial slogan there, I have a course called the Home Mastering Masterclass, which is an 8-week course where I kind of take people through my mastering process. And the unofficial slogan of that is, it ain't what you use, it's the way that you use it. So really, I don't do anything different if I'm working hybrid or if I'm working analog versus digital. It's the same process. It's the same goals when I'm working. They're just different tools. They might make it easier or harder to achieve what you want. So there's nothing fundamentally different. I think the main thing about hybrid is you need to think much more carefully about gain structure.
Exactly, yeah.
So most plugins, well, pretty much every DAW these days uses what they call floating point arithmetic. So we've been talking about not clipping and not pushing things above 0, but actually, if you push a song up at the beginning of your processing chain in Logic or Cubase or Pro Tools or wherever, back in the day, that would have clipped and that would have been bad. These days, no problem. The DAW knows that it's gone up to +4 or whatever, and it keeps track of that. And providing you get it under control by the time it hits the stereo output, the master fader, it's all good. And that applies also to the plugins. So you can hit an EQ plugin, a digital EQ plugin, with, say, peak levels at +6, and nothing bad is going to happen to the signal, providing you get the peaks under control before you play it out. The one exception to that is if you have something that is modeling a piece of analog gear, right? So if you have like an 1176 plugin or a Fairchild emulation or whatever, a lot of those plugins include in the emulation what would happen if you pushed the signal really hot in a piece of analog gear.
Exactly, yeah.
If you run those too hot in the box, then you might get stuff you don't want. I mean, you might like it and think it's cool, but probably in a mastering context, that's probably a bit more creative than you want to get. And that obviously really applies if you're actually using real analog gear. So when you're playing out, you don't want the peak levels to be anywhere near 0, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So I would suggest probably you play out to the pitch and catch, they call it, where you pitch the sound out and then catch it as you record it back in. So you want to pitch it out at -18 LUFS is probably a good place to be. And providing you've got high quality converters and the analog gear you're using is not super noisy, you could probably even go even quieter. But most pop rock mainstream mixes, -18 LUFS, loudness, kind of overall, you can push it a bit louder or have it a bit quieter.
Mm-hmm.
That's going to give you plenty of room for the peaks without getting anywhere near clipping. And then you can do all your analog processing externally, and then bring it back in still with plenty of headroom. And then you can lift the final level up using some digital tools at the end of the chain. And that would be, I guess that's another thing to the main value, I think, in hybrid is to go out for the kind of the analog flavor. Maybe you've got a Valve EQ, or some people run stuff onto tape or whatever, whatever it might be. And then the actual, I think probably the bringing the loudness up is probably better done digitally. Some people bring it up and clip the converters. I'm not a big fan of that personally, but it's all, there's about 10 ways to achieve anything you want to do in mastering, and providing it sounds good at the end of it, that's the most important thing. But yeah, I think the main thing is paying attention to gain structure, and kind of don't push the loudness too hard out of the box, unless, maybe you have some piece of analog kit that you really love the sound of when you're doing that. But if you do, then you need to make sure that you're not clipping when you come back in, unless you want to.
Yeah, exactly. Cool.
There's always an if or a but at the end of this stuff.
Yeah, always. John is asking, my mastering engineer has always requested my mixes peak at around -4 dBFS, leaving him room to do his thing. But I've heard others say they don't care where the peak is so long as it isn't clipping. What do you say about that?
So I'm one of the people who doesn't care where it is, providing it's not clipping. But if somebody asks me for a rule of thumb, I would tell them roughly -6. And that's basically to avoid people pushing it too hard earlier on.
Yeah, exactly.
Because I mean, if you think back to that example we were just talking about with the hybrid setup, or even especially if you've got a modeling plugin. I mean, nobody's good. Audio is music, is an art form, right? It's so it's all about taste. And if you like the sound of a piece of analog gear or an analog emulated plugin being pushed really hard, well, all power to you, right? That's your choice, your creativity. I think my concern with it is that lots of people don't realize that the analog kit was, because the reason the -18 number comes from the type of operating level that the original analog gear was designed for.
Exactly, yeah.
Right. So, back in the day, if you were working at Abbey, well, even today, if you're working at Abbey Road, there are engineers there with white lab coats who actually they don't wear white lab coats anymore, but they used to. And they're calibrating all of this stuff, and they expect the engineers to send stuff out with the right kind of in the right ballpark, so that the gear is going to work optimally. So if you have a piece of gear that's designed to work at -18, but you put a peak limiter on it before it went in, and it's pushed up to -14 or -10 or whatever, the whole thing is running 4-6 dBs too hot the whole time. And I mean, you might love the sound of that, but you also, especially if you're not experienced with this, you might not realize that that's not actually how it was intended to sound.
Yeah, exactly.
And like when we use analog gear and when we use analog emulation, everybody's after the kind of the secret sauce, the magic that was there in the gear back in the day. But if you're not using it the way they were using it, you might be missing out on a ton of that, or part of the equation of what made it so magical in the first place. So by suggesting peaks at -6 or -4 or whatever it is, really it's just encouraging people not to push it too hard, because once stuff is clipped, there's not a heck of a lot you can. I mean, there are things that can try and improve it, but it's not as good as having a clean signal in the first place. So my reason for recommending a lower level, and probably your mastering engineer, John, is it's not aimed at you specifically. It's just a general thing to his clients, because when people have that in mind, they just push things less hard,
exactly,
which reduces the risk of problems that they may or may not have known about along the way. So that's probably why. But I mean, in a technical sense, providing it doesn't clip, you're fine.
There you go. Okay, Christian is asking, he gave me a small tip. Thank you very much. Is 32 or 62 float bits used for mastering? So he's probably asking if he should bounce his final mix for mastering at 32-bit float or 64, or if there's any use of doing so.
Yeah, I mean, most of the modern, I've recently upgraded. I use Wavelab when I'm mastering, and the new version is 64-bit floating point. I'm not quite sure when they made that move. Latest version of Pro Tools is, I think a lot of DAWs are. The important bit is the floating point, not the 64-bit, to be honest. I'm not going to get this right, but somebody who knows far more about these things said to me that in terms of, I think they said it was something like, imagine you're here and somebody is on the moon. In terms of the scale of distance, right? The smallest number recordable by, I think, a 32-bit floating point signal would be smaller than the diameter of an atom.
Wow.
Right? So when you translate that kind of distance down to speaker vibrations, which is what ultimately all of this stuff ends up as, you don't need that precision. I know I've probably got something that wrong. Maybe that was the 64-bit example, or maybe, but it was that kind of comparison, right? Even a 32-bit floating point system can record the signal to such a level of accuracy that it completely blows any gear we have out of the water. I think the theoretical limit of analog gear in terms of the thermal noise, the hiss in the circuitry, is 22-bit. So even a 24-bit signal is perfectly capable of reproducing everything that was there in the analog signal to begin with. So 32-bit floating point is definitely overkill, and 64-bit is just kind of unnecessary.
Yeah, exactly.
It's basically pure marketing hype.
Yeah.
Having said that, there's no harm in it. I mean, it's extra processing power, and if you save it as 64-bit files, then it's twice as much disk space, which probably isn't getting you any real benefit in terms of the quality. But disk space is cheap, and processors are fast these days, so it's no big deal. Personally, I'm quite happy to get a 24-bit file for mastering. If somebody sends 32-bit floating point, even better. One of the cool things, like I said, about floating point is the clipping doesn't matter. So one great thing about a 32-bit floating bit point file, if you get it, is that even if it's hitting 0, you can just turn it down and you get the peaks back.
That's good.
So that's cool for a mastering engineer. I mean, okay, I say that it depends how the peaks were removed in the first place. But
yeah, but it's not going to sound any better as far as the sound quality goes.
No,
because people are asking that also. Does higher bit rate is going to sound better? It's like,
well, here's another interesting thing. One of my most popular videos was where I, it's surprising, but actually, even 16-bit, you get exactly the same resolution of the audio signal. The only difference between a 16-bit and a 24-bit signal is that the noise floor in the 24-bit signal is lower. So there's a tiny theoretical improvement. And I mean, as I say, I prefer to get 24-bit files as a mastering engineer, but I think that's historical, right? Because back in the day when I started out, 16-bit was the standard. You get stuff on DAT tapes, digital audio tapes. So when we kind of upgraded, we were able to send 24-bit files, it was like, whoa, this is so much better. And I knew less about the theory at that point and had not done the tests, and kind of you get into that habit of expecting a 24-bit file. So I always ask for 24-bit, but actually, I don't think we want to get into dither in this conversation, but providing it's a properly dithered 16-bit signal, you're going to be fine. But yeah, 24-bit is fine, 32-bit is fine, and the quality difference, I mean, this is the other thing. As soon as you shift the level by half a dB or tweak the EQ by a dB or two or whatever, or bring in a little bit of limiting and compression, those differences in sound are way bigger than the differences between the different file formats and stuff. So yeah, basically don't sweat it. 24-bit is fine, 32-bit float is fine. If you want to send 64-bit, that's cool.
There you go. Okay, I didn't read this one yet. Let's do it. Okay, also, when setting your final headroom to optimize a master for encoding for streaming, what quality of lossy compression do you optimize the headroom for? For example, an MP3 at 128 kilohertz.
Okay, so this is a complicated question. Because
so for example,
well, I'll try and make it simple. Loudness penalty measures the loudness and previews the final loudness, but it doesn't preview the final codec.
Okay.
So if you upload to Spotify, it's going to be, they use OGG Vorbis. If you upload to YouTube, they used to use AAC, which is the Apple thing that iTunes uses, but these days they're using something else, the name of which has just escaped me. But actually they have 3 or 4 different codecs, so they use different codecs for mobile than they do for... So basically your audio is going to get data compressed, right? Data encoded is a better phrase, to reduce the file size, to reduce the bandwidth that's needed, unless you go to somewhere like Tidal or Quobuzz that use lossless. So, and there are other ways of previewing that stuff if you want to hear it. There's a codec checker in Wavelab. There's one in the latest version of Ozone. Sonox make a standalone product that does it. There's a product called MasterCheck by NewGen Audio that previews the codec. And there's 2 reasons you might want to do that. One of it is that the quality gets worse, right? You can't, I mean, most of these things are reducing the size of the file by about 10 times. So they're throwing away 90% of the original data. They're not throwing away 90% of the quality, thankfully. This stuff is pretty clever. So you probably only hear maybe a 5 or 10% loss of quality, but it is a noticeable difference, especially when you preview it live using one of these tools.
Mm-hmm.
When they do that, you think about it, the process to do that, to take a 10 meg file and reduce it down to 1 meg or whatever it might be, is really aggressive. So this isn't what happens, but it's kind of like they split it up into 60 different bands using bandpass filters, so that cut out all the high and all the top and have just little bands, and then the codec looks at those bands and says which ones are most important, which ones we can hear most, encodes those, and then at the other end it reassembles that thing back into something that sounds amazingly like the original, considering what's been done to it in between. You can't do that and keep the peak level the same. So the peak level, we talked about LUFS and RMS, the peak level, which is what shows on the output of your DAW, the thing that goes up to 0 dBFS,
Exactly.
more or less tracks the shape of the waveform. It's very fast. It's completely useless for judging loudness, which is why we need LUFS and RMS. But it does tell you when things are going to clip or not. And what you'll find, if you master a song that peaks at 0, and then you encode it to, say, a 128 kilobits per second MP3 or AAC or Ogg Vorbis or whatever it is, the reconstructed waveform at the other end will end up with peaks that go above 0, which some people call them intersample peaks. Same thing happens, in fact, in a D2A converter. And if it doesn't have enough peak headroom, you can actually get clipping just on a CD player, for example. But the key thing, the main thing these days is on these streaming codecs, and it gets worse as you reduce the data rate, right? So mobile on Spotify, I think, is 96 kilobits per second. So the lower the data rate goes, the more aggressive the processing and the bigger the peaks on the reconstructed signal get.
So that's why they're suggesting a -2 peak level at the output of the limiter, for example.
That's why they're suggesting you give more peak headroom. Because the problem is that not all, but lots of the decoders, so in the player, that the encoded signal can, it's not floating point, but it's a kind of crude form of floating point. It can handle those peaks quite happily. But when it gets to the other end, the first thing they do is reduce it down to 24-bit or even 16-bit audio, and that's just done. They don't apply any gain beforehand. So if it's peaking at +3 or something, which lots of files are, they get sliced straight off. So you're adding another layer of clipping distortion into the signal that wasn't there when you mastered it, and you weren't listening to, because you weren't listening to the encoded version. So Spotify, for example, recommend peak levels of -1 if the loudness is below -14, or -2 if it's above -14. Because the other thing happens is a weird thing, that the more you push the loudness up against that peak level, the bigger those peaks after encoding and decoding get. So there's this weird thing of you push it louder and you get these bigger peaks and you get more clipping at the end. So you then have to pull it back further to stop those peaks happening in the first place in the encoder and the decoder. So then you come back to my thing of the sweet spot, right? If you follow my guidelines, so the bit that I didn't tell you was -10 at the loudest moments and keep your peaks at -1 dB true peak. True peak is something that you get in an LUFS meter. It's the same as a normal peak level, but it estimates what those overshoots might be in a D2A converter, or if it gets encoded. And so if you keep the peaks at -1, there's plenty of, even if it gets a bit mangled further down the line, hopefully it won't go over 0 at the decoder. So you should be clean. And if you keep the loudness down as well, so that the codec can do its job really well, those peaks are going to not be as bad as if you push the loudness super hot. If you want that super hot sound, if you're listening to all of this and going, that's all fine, Ian, but I'm still going to master at -8 because that's what band XYZ is, or that's what my clients expect, or whatever, I would still recommend that you then turn that signal down by a couple of dBs before submitting it online, because it won't have any effect on, it's going to get turned down anyway, won't have any influence on the overall sound of it, and you won't get those extra peaks and you won't cause that clipping. So Raytown Productions, the problem is, he's asking which data rate do you optimize for, right? Personally, my kind of benchmark is 128 kilobits per second. And that's what this suggestion is based on. So in my experience, if you master with the loudest bits at -10 LUFS and the peaks at -1, you're going to be good to go. It might well be that a 96 kilobits per second stream on mobile is going to cause some decoder clipping, especially at the loudest moments. My personal opinion is, if you're listening on a mobile data connection, and you've probably got earbuds and all the rest of it, you kind of deserve what you're getting. That sounds harsh. Yeah. I don't mean that much. But
no, you're right though.
I mean, the thing, because the problem is, at what point, when do you say enough is enough?
Yeah, exactly.
SoundCloud uses 64 kilobits per second for their web-based preview, which is why it sounds like
Imagine.
ants.
Yeah.
And I'm not prepared to compromise what I'm doing for that level of playback system, I guess, or encoding. But you can have a conversation with your clients. If they're super concerned about this, then and the thing is, if you're mastering really loud and it's going to be turned down by 4 dBs or whatever eventually, why not turn it down before you submit it?
Exactly.
Just to avoid. I'll tell you the answer to that. The answer is, of course, you can turn it off, right? So even though what I've been told is that only 15% of Spotify users disable loudness normalization. So it's on by default.
Okay.
In the mobile app and on the desktop. They don't use it online. That's another thing, right? So if you listen in a web browser, you're going to hear them unnormalized. So that's another reason that some people want to still push their stuff really loud. What was my point? Oh yeah, okay. So the reason you might not want to turn it down is that if you do, then it'll sound less impressive when people turn normalization off. But like I say, I feel like going forwards, that's less and less people, because most people are listening online.
Exactly.
I mean, YouTube is still the biggest, the place that most, particularly that people hear music first, and that's the key thing. That's when, if you care about loudness, that's the time you might want your stuff to be super loud, and it's not going to happen because it's YouTube and they just turn it down. So
exactly.
And I think the other thing is, I want to make my stuff that's future proof. It's like, we're in this kind of big complicated situation now where they're all doing different things, and it's hard to keep track of, but the situation is going to improve. Organizations like the AES are coming up with recommendations. Those recommendations get followed by gear manufacturers and by broadcasters, and eventually they'll get, currently the kind of the artists, to be honest, and the A&R reps at the record companies are lagging behind the technology and the recommendations by 5-10 years. Eventually, wow, they're gonna kind of figure this stuff out, because at the end of the day, it basically sounds better if you don't overcook stuff.
Of course.
And I just feel like I want, when we come out the other end, people to come back and listen to my masters from now and go, yeah, that sounds fantastic. Rather than, in 5-10 years time, people are going to be listening to that Miley Cyrus CD and going, well, what were they thinking? Why? In my opinion.
Guys, thank you for being here again. Don't forget to share this stream, like it on YouTube and on Facebook. Okay, let's jump on the next question from Jordy. I have downloaded songs from YouTube and they were very loud, -10 to -12 LUFS. How is that possible? I guess it depends. Like downloaded song from YouTube. There's some websites where you can just go and enter the link of the video in question and download the audio and video if you want to. Is that reliable? I don't know.
That's the answer. They don't change the original file. So if whatever you upload to YouTube, that's what it gets encoded as, which is why decoder clipping that we were just talking about is a problem. The change in level happens in your browser. So you can't, there's no download button on YouTube, but there are ways of downloading YouTube files. Yeah. If you do that, you will get the original loudness that was in the file. So some of them will be at -4 and -6, but nobody's ever going to hear them at that loudness off of YouTube. Actually, that's not strictly true either, because YouTube, well, less so these days, but 2 or 3 years ago, especially, it was a bit flaky. There were certain songs that weren't being normalized. There was no logic to it. It was just you'd get a random song that would be way louder than the rest. But that's been changing. There are examples of that where it didn't work a couple of years ago, and now when I listen to them, they're being normalized. So over time, that's going to correct. That's just
makes sense.
Kind of a quirk. But yeah, so basically the original file, the file that is on YouTube's server, is at the original loudness, the encoded file.
That's probably
just
what
gets
happened.
Turned down when you listen to it.
Makes perfect sense. Spotify say they prefer a FLAC file at 44.1 at whatever bitrate, and if it's louder than -8 RMS, they suggest -2 peak, like we talked about earlier. Mastering to -14 LUFS comes out quieter and lacks the effect of the limiter. Yeah, you know,
I would say not always, right? I mean, we kind of touched on that earlier.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think it is, you know, it's. I mean, people. So I actually come in for some flack for setting up the loudness penalty website, particularly for using the word penalty, because people are saying, well, why is it a penalty? It's just turning the stuff down. It's just a clean gain change. If it sounds great, who cares? And I agree with that. But the answer is we chose the name. We knew it would be a bit controversial, but we were happy with that because I am an advocate for dynamics. And what I see as a mastering engineer every day is stuff that is mastered way too loud and stuff that comes into me that's already louder than I would ever master it, right? And that just ties my hands. I can't get the best results that I can from that. So, you know, every day I make stuff louder as part of the mastering process, but I would like to see us come back from this kind of where we are, right? Where most things are mastered way too loud. So I'm very happy. I wanted the name of the website to be challenging, to be provocative, to make people think and to provoke debate. And it's achieved.
It actually makes you think, for sure.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, you know, just looking at it the other way, it's like, well, if your song's getting turned down by 4 dBs, that's not a loudness bonus, right? I mean,
no, exactly.
So we could have called it something dull like loudness preview or loudness offset or something, but you know, come on. Anyway, it's happened. So, yeah, people are. Some people are kind of like we talked about, thinking, "Oh, I need to master at -14," and that's not ideal either, right? What you need to do is master so that it sounds great, and then double check that you're happy with the results.
Exactly.
Right. And for me, for the loudest stuff, as I've said several times, that comes out as louder than -14. So I'm not being some kind of hypocrite by doing that. It's just that the reality is the music sounds better a couple of dBs louder and with a bit more processing, which is what Rob is saying. And that's why if you aim at -14, I think also combined with the Spotify effect, with the replay gain thing, where Spotify turns it down more than you would expect because of the LUFS, those two things together, you know, are making people kind of go, what's all this about -14? This isn't working for me. So having said that, I'm not saying you should push your stuff super loud, right? It's all about doing what sounds right for the music. And if it sounds right at -8 or -6 to you, you know, I'm not going to tell you that's wrong. I've never heard anything that benefited from going that loud, right? But that also plays into my tastes and my preferences, you know. So you know, it's a personal decision, but yeah, it's perfectly fine to go louder than -14, and probably for the loudest stuff you want to. That's true, and part of that is the sound of the limiting and the compression that helps you get there. Yeah.
Good. That's awesome. Ian, does the advice you gave about the -10 LUFS or RMS applies to all genres? I work primarily in metal, and we are often sitting at -7 RMS. I guess it goes with what you just said about, you know, if it sounds good and this is what you want, you know, I guess there's nothing wrong with that. But
yeah, I mean, so I would encourage you to do the experiment, right? So take your -7 RMS master, do another version where you just back off the limiter by 5 or 6 dBs, maybe not as much, 4 dBs, 4 dBs, right? Drop them both onto the loudness penalty website. You can have them open in separate tabs in the browser. Choose YouTube, say, preview one of them, then preview the other.
Yeah.
I would be prepared to bet good money you will hear hardly any difference. If you do hear a difference, then it's because the limiter is working super loud, super hard, which is something I prefer to avoid when I'm mastering. I'm not a fan of heavy limiting as part of the mastering process, but and if you do, then you make a choice. It's like, well, which one sounds better? If you don't hear any difference, my opinion is you might as well go with the quieter one. Less risk of decoder clipping, less processing overall. Some people might prefer it. If the one at -7 sounds way better to you, then you should obviously go with that. So that's one thing, is to do the experiment. The question about genres is interesting. Yes, my advice applies in every genre, but that doesn't mean you'll get the same results in every genre, right? So thinking back to, so if you take a metal tune that is sitting at, let's say, -10, which is my recommendation, but then you have an acoustic folk song, that might sit at -14. The loudest moments of that folk song, where the singer is really belting the guitar and singing out full voice, might get up to -10 briefly, same maximum loudness, but the song overall is going to be quieter. And yeah, I find that works really well cross genres. So you don't get the same overall values, but it works musically, which kind of comes back to, and that fits in. That the evidence also is there with Tidal and their loudness. Because you think that's exactly what they're doing, right? They're going to take a metal album, the loudest song, adjust it to a certain level, and then they're going to take a folk jazz fusion album, and the loudest song is going to be a similar loudness to the metal album on there. But when they do that, everybody's really happy with the way that it sounds. So yeah, I'm not saying all genres need to be mastered the same, but when you use this particular version of the rule, and you, as I say, if you want to have the loudest sections at -7 or -6 or whatever, that's a personal choice. And if it sounds good to you, then it's all good. But the strategy still works out well. And there was one other thing I was going to say about that, and I can't remember what it was now. Maybe it'll come back to me.
Okay, let's go with Farid. Hi guys, thanks for this live. Question number 1. When I analyze great songs, I notice that the difference between LUFS and RMS, about 1 dB value, are too close, and my master have always 3 dB difference when I have that. I'm not sure I understand, but
I think what you're seeing there is what I was talking about with the
difference between the LUFS metering and RMS metering, which are pretty close, but except we're talking about the base level that will affect the RMS meter differently than the LUFS.
Yeah, I mean, there's another side to that, which is that I talked about the bass, but the other difference is that our ears are most sensitive in the upper mids. So LUFS pays more attention to the upper mids than RMS. So the kind of the flip side of the bass thing, we talked about a bass heavy tune reading high on the RMS meters. You could have a song that is light on bass and has a lot of density in the upper mids, that kind of sort of 2K region. That's going to read loud on an LUFS meter because it sounds loud to us.
To humans, yeah.
But it's going to read low on the RMS meter.
So that could be a way to bring your master louder in a way, without being louder.
Well, it's
the perspective.
Well, I mean, one possible criticism of all of this loudness normalization stuff is that people are going to try and exploit the system, right? And one thing you can do to make your record sound louder is pile a load of bass in if you're working with an LUFS meter, because the LUFS meter won't pay as much attention to that bass. So you can use the bass to make your stuff sound louder. In comparison to, say, what an RMS meter would do. The problem with that is it starts to sound weird, right? Because your stuff just sounds ridiculously bassy. Or too edgy
Or
and upper mid range
yeah,
if you
too
go
mid.
the
Yeah,
other way.
exactly.
So, you know, I mean, it's absolutely a key aspect, right? So something
But it's
that
good
I'll
to
be,
know. It's
yeah,
good
well,
to know,
something
though.
I might be doing when I'm mastering a song is I've got the sound so I think it sounds right, and I just want a bit more aggression, but I don't want to push the overall loudness up for whatever reason. I might just tweak up those upper mids just a little bit more, just to give it a little bit more bite and energy. But I'm talking about sort of half a dB in that case, you know, really fine stuff. When you start making really big moves, things just start sounding wrong for the genre they're in. So I suspect, yeah, what Farad is seeing is a combination of EQ differences and the different metering systems. Try the loudness penalty site and see whether that is better, whether that gives you, you know, more reliable results.
Yeah.
Hopefully it
I,
will.
I have the link in the description of the video. Okay, so there's the link directed to the loudness penalty analyzer website, and also just a reminder that the plugin is on sale this week at $34 US, which is a very good deal for this this wonderful tool, I have to say. And I'm going to link the video that I made a year ago about this plugin. Yeah, actually, that was a good video that a lot of people liked, actually, you know. So let's go with the next one, and let's talk about SoundCloud. I uploaded some music on SoundCloud, and I noticed they don't keep the same loudness.
Right. So the two places online that are not doing this at the moment are SoundCloud and Beatport. Actually, Bandcamp don't either.
Okay.
And that's a real shame because, especially indie musicians, you know, I mean, on the one hand, the loudness wars is really a feature of the big record companies where, you know, there's honestly a ton of suits who don't really care about the music, who just want big numbers in terms of sales, you know, and they're like, make it loud, just make it loud. That's what sells. Do it. They're not interested in having a conversation about all the stuff that we've been talking about here about the musicality and what sounds better and what sounds worse and all the rest of it. It's just like, just do that because it makes us money. I'm you know, I'm stereotyping them, but there is truth to that. Whereas indie customers, you know, if I do a lot more work for indies these days, and if you're talking directly to the client, to the artist, they're always, you know, they care about the material, they care about the music. There's a lot more often interest in all of these things. Unfortunately, lots of them, a lot of their audience and a lot of where they get their attention and you know, kind of build an audience is places like SoundCloud and Bandcamp and Beatport, which are not currently using normalization, which means that the loudness wars are still in full effect. And especially if if you're on SoundCloud and you get pulled out and put into a playlist where you're 6 dBs quieter than everybody else, that's gonna stop your song, you know, standing out in the same way that it might have done. So that is a real shame, and I do understand that. Excuse me. Having said that, I've worked with various clients who've had this issue with me, and my masters have been loud enough that they've been happy, because there's a lot more variety when you listen somewhere like SoundCloud, right? So to some extent, the users are used to the fact that some things are louder than others. And I mean, the other thing is, the weird thing about this is that it's always the artists and the musicians who really care about this stuff. Sound on Sound magazine did an experiment a few years ago, and they didn't even change they didn't do more or less limiting or compression or any of it. They just did songs at different levels. And in their tests, people didn't care. It's like their preference was, do I like this song or not? Most people don't notice differences in loudness of 2 or 3 dBs, just completely passes them by. So this stuff that we all obsess about so much, in the real world, I'm not sure how much difference it really makes. You know, I think to some extent, you could say that the mastering profession shot themselves in the foot 10 or 15 years ago, because, you know, one of the things that you could do as a mastering engineer to make somebody's mix sound better was to make it louder. And they would explain that to their client. I mean, I used to. You explain to, you know, listen, how much better it sounds now. But the problem is it didn't stop, right? It just kept getting louder and louder and louder. And now we're where we are with everything at ridiculous levels. So to some extent, I think it's a kind of an invented problem. You know, I've called it it's like an old wives' tale. You know, it's like, oh, your stuff needs to be loud in order to do this. Well, no, actually, it doesn't. There's academics in universities who've done research and shown that there's no connection between loudness and sales. There's no connection between loudness and user preferences. The only thing that anybody has shown actually there in the data is that people don't like being blasted by super loud stuff. So actually, if you make your stuff super loud, you're more likely to annoy people than to not. Anyway, I understand the concern. It's still a problem on SoundCloud and these places, unfortunately. Well, all I would say is it's going to happen there.
Yeah, eventually.
Because there's more standardization. LUFS is an internationally agreed standard.
Mm-hmm.
It's happening on broadcast. Who knows how long it'll take, but it's going to happen.
Mastering on headphones with or without software correction, like SonarWorks, for example. Do you do it on your side? If you are, no. If your room is still not that if your room is not still that good, do you still think it's a good idea?
Mastering on headphones is one of the options I suggest to people on the masterclass course, because especially if you're mastering your own stuff, it's a challenge. If you're working in the same room and on the same monitors that you've mixed it in, the problem is that your room might be lying to you, right? If your speakers have too much bass, or if there's a cancellation because of the shape of the room or whatever, and you haven't got acoustic treatment, it's like having an Instagram filter on a photo. You take the photo and you think, oh, that looks great, and then you send it to somebody else who's not using the same filter, and they're like, well, this looks weird, or just doesn't look as good as you expected it to. Same thing happens in your room. The room and the speakers effectively put a filter over the audio, and you master it and mix it to sound good with that filter on. Then you take it out and play it somewhere else with a completely different filter or no filter at all, and it doesn't sound the way you expect. So ideally, monitoring wants to be completely neutral, as uncolored as possible. So it's a kind of complete middle line. So then if somebody plays it on Beats headphones, it'll have the loads of bass as they expect. If they play it on Apple earbuds, it'll sound tinny as they expect. That's part of the whole goal of translation is one of the things that comes out of mastering. The challenge is, if you are working on stuff in the same room that you mixed and mastered it on, it's not going to sound any different. What sounded good to you then is going to sound good now as well. And one thing you can do is to get another opinion by either taking it and listening to it somewhere completely different, in a car or in a living room, somewhere where you listen to a lot of music, so you know what you expect things to sound like, and then make some notes and come back in and try and address those. But another thing you can do is a pair of headphones. And the advantage of the headphones is that because the speakers are right on your ear, they take the room completely out of the equation. It's not something that I do personally. I prefer to work on speakers, but I did an episode of the Mastering Show interview with Glenn Schick.
I heard that one. I was about to ask.
In the US, and he mastered an album a couple of years ago that went to #1 in the Billboard charts. He works exclusively on headphones and a laptop, 100% in the box. He masters on the beach, sitting there.
Imagine that.
Some long, tall drink. Yeah, that's a lifestyle that I can relate to.
Same here.
And he gets great results, and there are more and more people saying this and doing this. So it's definitely an option. It's very different. Stuff sounds different on headphones than it does on speakers. So you're going to have to take a lot of time to learn how things should sound. I mean, I know from experience when I'm mixing, I've mixed on headphones in the past. Just for example, I tend to mix the drums too low. So I take the headphones off, stick it on the speakers, and it's like, well, the drums are too quiet. And that's just to do with the way that we hear stuff in headphones versus speakers. So you need to be careful, but it's definitely possible, especially with some of the really top flight headphones. I've got a pair of Sennheiser HD650s, which are kind of an industry standard, high quality. They're not massively expensive, but they're a really good headphone.
Open backs, eh?
Open backs, yeah. Which is quite scary. Sometimes you've been working on them, you take them off and you put them down. It's like, oh my God, I was just pumping that into my ears. And if I'm using them, I don't always use correction software. But if, for example, one of the things that's nice about headphones is if you've got any concerns about the bass, because the bass is the most likely thing that's going to go wrong in your room.
Yeah, definitely.
A high quality pair of headphones like those can give you a different kind of objective opinion on the bass. Yeah. But out of the box, they are not completely flat. They're a bit down in the sub, they're a bit up between 100 and 200, and they're a little bit soft in the high end. So if you want to really the most accurate you can get, then you want to use some software. And what I would say is, if you're going to use something like SonarWorks, get the custom profile. So send your headphones away or buy a pair that's been pre-calibrated and get the dedicated calibration profile for those
Totally
headphones.
agree.
Because they have the software comes with a kind of generic like setting, an average setting for example 650s like those. It's better, but it's not right. So by which I mean, if I play stuff from my back catalog on it, I listen and think, not quite. When they sent me the personalized calibrated profile for that pair of headphones, then I play stuff and I'm like, oh yeah, okay, that sounds really good. I'm really happy with that. So it's definitely worth getting the fine-tuned profile for the pair of headphones you've got. So yeah, I think it's worth trying.
On my side, the only problem I have with using SonarWorks on the headphones is the referencing. You know, when you want to learn your headphones, you need to listen to a lot of music. And by using SonarWorks, you know, you're going to be slave to using those headphones, using your DAW or, you know, your computer straight. And, you know, on my side, I'm going to listen to music out of my phone, out of another device or another computer. So that's the only reason why I tend not to use SonarWorks using my headphones. For speakers, that's a different story. But for my headphones, I want to learn how those headphones sounds like, the good and the bad. And I just make sure I know them properly, you know?
Yeah. I mean, it's I'm kind of similar because I used those for years without SonarWorks.
Yeah.
So yeah, I kind of having said that, every so often, well, I mean, when I did the masterclass videos, I did the mastering for them on headphones because I wanted to be able to talk while the music was playing without any spill. And I had a kind of homemade profile that I used on the output of them. There was one song where I didn't have that switched on when I mastered it. And at the last video in the series, I bring all of these songs together and go, okay, so now see how these fit together. And let's look at what, you know, putting stuff together and what you need to do to make a CD master and all that kind of stuff. And this one song didn't fit in and I had to adjust it kind of retrospectively.
Yeah.
So it does make a difference. Yeah, I mean, it's a personal thing, you know. Some people can adjust very quickly. I mean, a tip actually that applies to working on headphones or even on anything else which is super simple and free, best kind, is to just listen to a ton of music on whatever it is you're going to be mixing and mastering on. You know, the kind of the classic thing is we build these little studios for ourselves, this place where you can go and work on your music and all the rest of it. And we only work on our own stuff. And then you go out into the outside world and play it on everybody else's systems and it doesn't sound quite right. And the reason is you haven't adjusted to what it sounds like in the room. So the solution is just to, like, you know, when you're, I don't know, doing your accounts or emailing people or surfing the web or whatever it is, just have music on in the background. Just listen to it constantly, all the stuff that you like and you think sounds great. And over time, your ears will just learn how stuff should sound on your speakers or on your headphones or whatever it is. And then you'll have better instincts when you come to actually work on it in the mastering.
No, I lost that question, but there was one about, it was asking, why do you work with WaveLab opposed to other software as for mastering?
So originally, because it was cross-platform. So I worked for an independent mastering company here in the UK for the first 15 years of my career. I left to set up on my own, and I was dry hiring their studios so that I could still do mastering work because I didn't have a mastering studio. And then unfortunately 2 months later they went bust. And I tried to buy all of their gear, but somebody outbid me. So I lost access to the studios. So at that point I was moving from, I had just a little setup at home, and I had luckily an old colleague who'd set up a studio that I was able to hire to work in. He was PC, I was Mac, and WaveLab was cross-platform, still is. So I could move stuff between the two. But also, I just really like it. It was a lot of the early stuff in WaveLab was very similar to the software that I used before, which is called Sadie, which is kind of the industry standard mastering software. These days, I mean, it's super powerful. It's one of the best, and it's going to sound silly, but one of the main reasons, because like for example, Studio One I think has DDP image support. So if you want to make a CD master, you want to save it as a DDP image, which is like a disk image with all of the metadata embedded and all the rest of it. It's
Exactly.
error correction built in, super secure for sending it online and stuff. There's third party. There's Hoffa and
Hoffa is, yeah.
I think Sonorous make DDP software.
But WaveLab works great for DDP. That's the only reason I use WaveLab.
DDP stuff built in, and also, but I was going to say, so does Studio One. But I experimented with Studio One just out of interest because people were asking me about it. I really liked it. It didn't have enough crossfade shapes.
Oh, okay. Okay.
WaveLab has a ridiculous number.
Yeah.
So silly little stuff like that. But also the metadata support is great. So you type in the details and all of the stuff, and you can export it in multiple formats just with a click of a button, and it auto names it and puts it in the folders and all that stuff really well. It's basically convenience. It's workflow. You can get great results in terms of the sound working in pretty much any software these days, especially if you're using third-party plugins.
Yeah, exactly.
And then you just, if you want to make a CD master, you can deal with that afterwards. But yeah, so those are the reasons that I like WaveLab. It's got great metering, really good loudness meter, built-in true peak monitoring, really nice frequency analyzer that I like.
It looks like a beast.
It's very cool. And recently they've also, used not to be great for pitch and catch for sending stuff out to external gear, but they've improved the options for all that. They've just added some really nice stuff for reference tracks recently, which is really cool. So yeah, and it's a dedicated mastering app kind of built from the ground up. So, but I mean, there are other brands are available.
How have you set up WaveLab for hybrid mastering? Do you have any course in that, or do you have like a video on YouTube or something that talks about WaveLab and analog gear and stuff?
I don't yet. And it's something I'm going to experiment more because so Justin Perkins, who also uses WaveLab and is super active in their forums, was telling me the other day that he uses the reference track feature to play stuff out to pitch the stuff to his external gear and then capture it back in. I mean, basically what they did recently is they made it much more flexible, so you can do it whatever way you like. I don't have any videos on it because almost everybody I talk to is mastering in the box. And actually, I mean, that's still my preference for what it's worth. When I was trained as a mastering engineer, having DDD on your CD, meaning recorded, mixed, and mastered digitally, was thought to be a cool thing. Whereas
I remember when that came out, that
was the thing.
Back then, like, that is a so cool thing,
Exactly. Whereas, these days it's all about getting back to the analog stuff. So I was trained to work 100% digitally, not in the box. I was using digital hardware at that point. But I mean, there's no difference, right? It's, digital is digital. So I really like the control and that's something I was going to say. The earlier question about hybrid would be, just ask yourself whether you're getting a real benefit from it. I hear people say, oh, I just run it out and back through the converters because I like the way that it sounds. And on the one hand, maybe that's fine. But on the other hand, as far as I'm concerned, the only thing that can happen if you do that is to degrade it. You're just going to add a bit of noise and maybe some phase strangeness and depending on how good the gear you're running it out through is, Glenn Schick, says the point where he moved in the box was simply because he just found he was consistently getting better results. There's a few other, especially mixing engineers as well. Well, I mean, Sheps is working 100% in the box these days.
Chad Lake, same thing.
And both of them, it's got to the point now where these days there are the tools available to achieve the same results that you used to get out in the analog domain. But you avoid going through a set of converters and running it through, another processing chain or another set of wires. So So yeah, no, I don't have any specific advice other than the whole gain staging thing.
Exactly. Like
But I mean,
we
I might look at that in future because it's probably going to become a more common question. So if there's enough demand, then I'll probably put something together mentioning that.
Cool. And talking about your course, what is your website with the mastering course? Don't know if you said it and I missed.
So
yeah, what about your mastering course?
What about my mastering course? Well, it's running at the moment. I run it 3 or 4 times a year. It's an 8-week course. Excuse me. Except actually, there's a couple of bonus weeks, so it's slightly longer than that. It's basically sort of fly on the wall. I have a few products. There's a home mastering compression, which is using compression and limiting in mastering. Home mastering EQ, which is how I use EQ, what my goals are, strategies for mastering. Those are available all the time. You can see those are available on my website, productiondevice.co.uk. Just click on the products link at the top. The masterclass course is a specific. With those ones, you just download the whole thing and you get to use it. The masterclass course, I send it out once per week. You get a new video every week where I master a new song using a different piece of software, basically to stop overwhelm because there's so much of it. And also, if you're doing the course, you can email me with questions. I have Q&A questions, just like this one, where people on the course can come in and ask questions. I will answer everybody's questions, and we have a conversation about it. So I can address any specific questions that people have, and everybody gets to benefit from the answers. So yeah, it's running at the moment. So you can't join now because I think we're on week 6. So it's
yeah, so if you're on my mailing list, the next time Ian opens the course, you're going to get an email. Okay, because I think twice a year I promote this course on with my mailing list. So just make sure you're on the mailing list and you'll get notified when this very cool course is going to open up. Okay, I just have to take this one. Thank you for the tip. Hey, Chris, my Cubase is not getting the effects from Wave that I paid for. How do I fix that? That is a very broad question. So I would suggest you just to write me a more specific question about what you're having as far as your problem goes with Cubase. You can leave that in the comment section of this video or just, send me an email. Okay, and I'm going to try to help you out with that. Okay, now let's go with... what else do I have here? Okay. No.
That's a reply to the one you just had.
Exactly. So let's go and see if we have anything else. I think we're going to be close to the end of this stream. We've been going on for, wow, 1 hour and 37 minutes so far, Ian. You must be tired. It's like pretty late where you are.
I'm usually up till midnight.
Okay.
So, but I'm probably start to doze off soon after this.
Okay, GRL, I took Ian Shepard's home mastering course, been mastering for clients for 2 years after that. Thank you, Ian. So I just wanted to point that out, just to show you guys that this course is a very good one. Okay, so I think we're done here. Let me check if I have... I'm just going to answer this one briefly. Does Cubase not have DDP software? I don't think it does internally in Cubase. It's with WaveLab that you will have DDP option to work that out, which works very great, like we said earlier. I use it on my end. That's the only thing I use in WaveLab for now anyways.
WaveLab's a fairly expensive option if all you want is DDP. I think the Hoffa have a plugin that you
and it's very cheap. It's not like the Alpha software itself, the DDP app. It's like less than $100 or so, something like that.
Oh, really?
Or maybe a bit more. That was, I think I bought that version years ago, and it wasn't that expensive, if I'm correct. Maybe they increased the price since then. I don't know. So I think that's going to be good, Ian. So far, guys, you know what? Let's go with one last question, okay? And then we're going to let Ian go. What about this one? When mastering, what are you doing to make sure the songs are balanced? So I guess this is in a situation where you're mastering a full album and not only one song.
So my number one tip for that would be to listen to the vocal level, and get the vocal levels consistent between each song. It's amazing how effective that is. I have there's, especially if you do a compilation album, because those kind of things tend to be fairly consistent on a, especially if it's all been mixed and produced by the same person. But if something's been recorded over a long period of time or in a load of different studios, or especially if it's a compilation where they're different artists, different engineers, the whole thing, things can be all over the place. But if you make that consistent, so you could imagine one mix where the vocal is quite buried, so the backing is right up there, and then another one where the vocal is right out front and the backing is more set back. If you get the vocal level consistent between them, that tends to work. If there are no vocals, you could go for the lead instrument in a kind of instrumental sense, or the lead synths or something. That's a really good tip. I mean, on top of that, the recommendations I mentioned for loudness, if you get the loudest points of each song to be similar at the beginning of the process, and then listen to them and consider using some automation, right? So one thing that can happen is if you make those loud moments all roughly the same loudness, when you go back and listen, you might find that like the verses of one of the songs sound a bit low in comparison to one of the other ones. One of them might sound fine, and the other one, the verses sound a bit low. Don't be tempted to push that whole song up to get the verses louder, because when you do that, the loud sections will be too loud, and they'll probably hit all of the processing. You've got the limiting and the compression too hard. What you can do, I mean, you could go back to the mix and tweak the mix, but actually it's pretty effective to just put in an overall global automation on the song to lift up the quieter sections by maybe a few dBs, perhaps, just to adjust that balance between the sections of the song.
Yeah, we tend to forget about automation in mastering. We think about automation in mixing, but not a lot in mastering. It's not like a reflex that we have, but it is a very good tool to use.
It is. It's super powerful. I mean, there are some engineers out there who would kind of like really upset by the suggestion. They'd say, no, that's a mix decision, and whatever the artist decided in the mix is what you should stick with. I disagree with that. I just think, my other key, my thing about mastering is to make it sound the best it can be, and you do whatever is necessary to do that. Now, there's a point where you're doing so much that you kind of think, actually, I shouldn't have to do this. We need some mix alterations. But just a simple balance thing, because if that's what happens if you're using a compressor, if you do the other thing and push the whole level up, the compressor is going to hold stuff back during the loud section. It's just not going to sound as good. You have to be a little bit careful with the transition. If you've got a slow build, you can do a gradual automation fade that works against it. But usually it works best to just find the perfect point to kind of make that cut. So, classic example is nice quiet introduction, and then bang, it hits you at the loud section.
Yeah.
So you set the level of the loud section, then you listen to the intro, and you think, it feels a bit weak. You can lift it up with automation, and you just do a really fast change at the point where the loud section hits. Nobody will ever hear the difference. It just works better in terms of the overall balance. So kind of combination of those strategies, I think, is going to help you get really good results.
One question from Chaz from Electric Owl Works. Good to see you, man. Ian, any thoughts about FabFilter Pro Q2 or the Pro Q3? And same for Miguel channel. That can be around the same question. Any plugins you prefer to use? Yep,
I really like FabFilter. I'm not paid to say that. I really like the Pro Q. I have got the Pro Q3 now.
Yeah.
And I
did you use the dynamic EQ part of it a lot, or?
Well, I haven't experimented with it yet.
Okay.
That's actually the real reason I wanted to upgrade was the fact that you can now have. They always used to let you choose between minimum phase and linear phase. I'm a big fan of using linear phase EQ most of the time, but not in certain instances, like with a low cut. So back in the day, you'd have to have two sets of EQ, and one of them was minimum phase and one of them was linear phase. It's really nice now that you can have individual settings in FabFilter. But yeah, the dynamic EQ is the other thing that I want to play with, and I just haven't had time to get into it. I'm not always a huge fan of dynamic EQ, but if anybody can get it right, FabFilter can. It's
for sure.
I don't think there's anything particularly magical about the sound of the EQ. Digital EQs on the whole tend to be pretty, take it or leave it.
Yeah, exactly.
But I think FabFilter really nailed it with the interface. It's just a really nice
big time
interface to work in. It's really intuitive and quick. So yeah, I'm a big fan of all of their stuff.
Yeah, it is one of my go-to EQs. So, and then let me get one last question. Okay, have you used the control room from Cubase for mastering? The control room is only, like, for me, I use it as a reference tool when it comes to plugins. Okay, so for mastering per se, I'm gonna say no, except for maybe a graphic analyzer if I need one. It's gonna be it's already into my control room anyways, on a permanent level. And let's finish with this one. What happened to your finger, man? Yeah, I kind of. And I'm going to finish with this one. Okay, so this is going to be the last question of today's stream. I was sharpening up a knife, a cooking knife, and I did the job pretty well, apparently. Yeah, so it's healing slowly, but it's healing. It's better. So that happened last week, and in not too soon, I'm going to be able to remove that. So that's what happened. All right, Ian. Thank you very much. It's just funny to answer a mixing and mastering related question.
My pleasure. So, thanks for having me.
Thanks, Ian. It was awesome. It was awesome, and from what I see, people are enjoying this stream for sure. And so there was a lot of stuff in that session. So guys, I'm going to encourage you to go back and watch the sections that you think you need to go back and listen again, because there's a lot of stuff that even on my end, I'm just going to probably go back and listen to the stuff Ian said. Yeah, with the codex part, especially, as far as I'm concerned. That was a complicated topic, but you answered it pretty well. So thank you guys for being here again, for joining us during this very cool stream. Thank you, Ian, again. And guys, I'm going to be back live, if not next week, the following week with another guest. All right, guys, take care. Don't forget to like on your way out and to share this stream. It's going to be on the permanent. It's going to be permanently available on YouTube afterwards. Take care. See you guys.